What I'm going to be doing is bringing the words of the previous speakers and the images that they put before us into dialogue with our rich biblical tradition of mercy. We're invited to develop a merciful imagination. And I trust that an exploration of the first story we're going to look at will help us to develop that merciful imagination, just as the images that Phil has shown us stir our hearts to create a merciful imagination and to move beyond that to action. Mercy is a way of being in the world. I want to make it more and more my way of being in the world, and I hear the call of Pope Francis that it might become a way of being for us all. Pope Francis's call to celebrate a Jubilee Year of Mercy is grounded in the cry of the whole earth community for compassion and mercy. We're called to, as Pope Francis said, leave space for mercy and understanding in relation to the entire earth community, human and other than human. Elizabeth Johnson, American theologian, has articulated a vision that we could well make our own as we celebrate the Year of Mercy and as we move beyond the Year of Mercy to implement all the ways we've explored of being mercy in our world. She puts it this way: a flourishing humanity on a thriving planet, rich in species, in an evolving universe, altogether filled with the glory of God. Such, she says, is the vision that must guide us at this critical time of Earth's distress, shown to us so powerfully in Phil's talk and in the images that he put before us. She says we must do this to practical and critical effect. So how can we realize this dream? What inspiration can we derive from our sacred stories? We, as companion travelers towards God's dream for creation or vision for creation in an expanding universe. My task in this session is to explore with you just one biblical story, one marvelous biblical story, a story of mercy that was written in Hebrew, a story told and retold, enacted and reenacted over 2,500 years or more. It's a story that forms a key part of our sacred heritage. We hear it anew in light of the earth's distress in our times. We recognize that this story, like all biblical stories, comes out of a pre-scientific, patriarchal and hierarchical world. So we can expect the text to inscribe the cosmology of its time, not the cosmology of our time. We can expect that the other than human world may be presented simply as a backdrop for human drama. We can also expect that the biblical text will be male-centered, even in stories with predominantly female characters. And so we approach the text, any biblical text, with a will to retrieve from beneath the surface of the text what is life-affirming in our times, such as the hidden presence, the voices, and the agency of women, of non-elite men, and of other than human earth elements. We seek to value and honor the intrinsic goodness and integrity of all the earth elements at play in the text. So with this in mind, we turn to the story of the Hebrew people in Egypt enslaved and beleaguered by a despotic ruler, a merciless ruler, who perceives them as a military threat and seeks to rid the land of their presence. Is this story true? Yes. Did it happen? Probably not, as recounted here. Is it happening now? Yes. Again and again, and in many places on our planet. The story tells us that a new king arose over Egypt. Faced with a rapidly increasing Israelite slave population, he issues an edict that is intended to reduce, if not eliminate, the military threat the Israelites pose to Egypt. You all know the story. The people are subjected to bitter slavery. But the more they are enslaved, the more they increase. In other words, they implicitly obey the Genesis command to increase and multiply and refuse to bow to all the might of Egypt. The king, or the Pharaoh as he's now called, issues a second edict, this time to the midwives of the Hebrews. I invite you to pause for a moment and see if you can remember the names of the midwives and the number of the midwives. There are just 2 midwives called Shiphrah and Puah. Note the irony of this. The might of Egypt is threatened by a people that need only 2 midwives. They're instructed, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she shall live. The midwives fear God. The midwives hold God in awe. In other words, they're in right relationship with God. They do not obey this edict, but they let the boys live. They leave space for mercy in the face of a merciless edict. These 2 feisty women are summoned by the Pharaoh and asked to explain their refusal to obey. So now they're on the Pharaoh's turf. Their creative response stands as witness to their ingenuity and their steadfast love or mercy in the face of a powerful other who leaves no space for mercy. Their answer: because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they're vigorous, and the babies pop out before the midwife comes. They give birth before the midwife comes to them. That's their courageous response. The refusal of the midwives to kill the male children is the catalyst for the 3rd edict. Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live. The girls are no threat. They can live while the boys must die. Why is it that the girls can live? Why might this be? How do we read this? With the death of the male babies and the female children will the female children eventually be sexually available to Egyptian men and their children then become assimilated into the Egyptian community? Whatever the answer to those questions, let's turn to the story of just one response to the 3rd edict. We have already encountered 2 key agents of mercy and compassion, namely the midwives of the Hebrews, Shiphrah and Puah. We're about to encounter other agents of mercy, as well as some notable instruments of mercy and compassion. So we turn to the text. In these verses, we hear first of a marriage between a man and a woman who are both of the tribe of Levi. So, a son of Levi and a daughter of Levi. Neither is named at this point. The woman conceives and bears a son. Contemporary readers are left with the impression that this son is their first child. That may not have been the case for those who first heard this story. The story goes on to state that when the mother saw he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. Now, the word used of the baby is simply the adjective, the Hebrew adjective, good, tov. In a time and place of infant mortality, of high infant mortality, as in Kiribati today, this child had a chance of survival. There's no suggestion in the narrative that other Israelite women obeyed the Pharaoh's edict. We just have this one story. This is the one story we have of a further refusal to obey a merciless edict. And we're told this story because it's of its bearing on the rest of the biblical story. As biblical scholar, Jesuit biblical scholar Tony Campbell frequently asserted, the Bible is the storyteller's companion. And around the ancient campfire, the Israelites would have told and retold their stories, instinctively filling the gaps. Now, we too are invited to fill the gaps in the biblical stories, even if our knowledge of the ancient world might lead us astray sometimes in our efforts. But I invite you to imagine the planning that goes into the protection of this healthy baby boy. The whole family is involved, including an older sister who suddenly appears in the narrative. And hers is a crucial role. You see, his sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. As the story unfolds, we discover why the child's father plays no role in the execution of the plan. And that might be something that you search out for yourselves in your discussion. The story assumes that the family, at least the mother and daughter, have some knowledge of the movements of the Pharaoh's daughter and her entourage. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. What happens first? The mother takes a basket made of papyrus reeds. She plasters it with bitumen and pitch to waterproof the basket. Already we find earth elements being engaged as instruments of compassion and liberation. You might find further evidence of this in the narrative. The child's sister stands at a distance. She's part of the plan. She keeps watch. Her role in the first instance is to see what happens. Her baby brother, though condemned to death by drowning, is never abandoned by his family. What does the little girl see? You may like to be her for a few moments, to stand at a distance and watch the daughter of the Pharaoh approaching with the attendants and preparing to bathe in the river. She sees the basket among the reeds and she sends her maid to bring it. She opens it and sees the child. He is crying. He's hungry, no doubt. And the NRSV translation says she takes pity on him. Now that verb used here, chamal, it's a mercy word and it has two semantic fields. It can mean to have compassion, as in Joel 2:18, and God had compassion on the people, or it can mean to set a captive free, to liberate. So those two fields, two meanings, to liberate and to have compassion, all of that is part of mercy. The one who hears the cry of the poor in this instance is the Pharaoh's daughter. God is the one in the Hebrew scriptures who hears the cry of the poor. But here it's the Pharaoh's daughter. The daughter of the oppressor provides an image of the God of Israel. Now, just in case anyone might think that the Pharaoh's daughter in this story isn't any doubt about the Hebrew identity of the child, we have a look at what she says. This must be one of the Hebrews' children. In other words, she knows exactly what she's doing. And at this point, the sister re-enters the drama. She's a feisty little girl too, just like the midwives. She asks her well-rehearsed question, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Now, the yes in response to this question is one of the most important words in the whole of the biblical story. There'd be no Exodus story without this response. The girl calls her mother, who's waiting in the wings, her breasts bursting with milk. The Pharaoh's daughter hands this endangered child back to his own mother and makes it possible for her to care for him. He will know his own people, his own identity, and eventually his own destiny. He's not only restored to the family, he's embraced as son by the one who showed him compassion and spared his life, the daughter of the oppressor. The language of mercy is present in this story. It's predicated of the Pharaoh's daughter. As we've seen, however, the mercy of God transcends the use of mercy language. Mercy is a way of being in the world for the midwives, Shifra and Puah, for Moses' mother and sister and father, I suggest, for the maid who fetched the basket, and above all for the Pharaoh's daughter who heard the cry of the vulnerable child, of the child at risk, who had compassion on him and set him free to be himself within his own family and among his own people. Mercy and liberation are two sides of the one coin. There are many other dimensions of mercy in the biblical tradition. We find mercy as chesed, as steadfast love, loyalty, kindness, hospitality, always a doing thing. We find mercy as womb compassion. We find God as a womb compassionate God. The words that are used are derived from the Hebrew word for womb, rechem. You may like to revisit the final section of the suggested reading for this session, where you will find some comments on the many ways that Hebrew was translated into Greek. Just recalling that one word that occurs in this text. He was crying, and she had compassion, or she had pity. There is no word in English that conveys all the dimensions of mercy in the Hebrew. Pope Francis invited us to celebrate a Jubilee year of mercy. In Laudato Si, he's called us to hear and respond with compassion to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. You might, in your discussion time, like to consider how the Exodus story of a child at risk speaks to the distress of the earth community today. And how does it speak of mercy as a way of being in our world? Thank you.